Thornton. The President and CEO of IDEA. I'd like to welcome you all to the IDEA webinar series. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is brought to you by Train, an IDEA sustaining sponsor. It's scheduled to last 1 hour, but we can extend if there are additional questions. All the lines are muted. We would ask during the presentation if you would please submit your questions in the lower right-hand box of the screen. So please type them in as we go. At the conclusion of the presentation, our speaker, Bo Griffey, I'll moderate the questions and he'll answer as many as time allows, and we'll try to get through them. The webinar will be recorded. For those of you on the line, at the conclusion, you'll get an email, so you'll have access to the slides in PDF format and also as a streaming video so that you can forward to colleagues unable to join. So with that, let me introduce our speaker for the day. Again, Bo Griffey is a client executive with Train. In this role, he's responsible for executive-level energy account support, and that includes monitoring daily fundamentals and technical factors affecting current energy markets. This includes assessing risk tolerance, recommending physical and financial purchasing strategies, evaluating demand-side management, renewable energy and other energy-related sustainability options, improving opportunities, and really coordinating all aspects of account fulfillment. Bo's professional background includes positions both with public and private energy corporations in business development, consulting, mergers and acquisitions, sales management, trading, startup commercialization, and sustainability. In the last few years, Bo has developed a 50-megawatt pipeline of renewable energy and low-emissions projects with technologies that include biogas, solar, wind, storage, and combined heat and power. Bo is a certified energy manager and energy procurement professional. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Central Missouri and an MBA with an emphasis on finance from Rockhurst University, the Hellsberg School of Management. So let's give a nice warm welcome to Bo Griffey. And Bo, why don't you take it away? The ball is yours.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate the introduction, and I want to thank everyone for joining us here this afternoon. We're going to spend a little time talking through renewable energy procurement strategies, and we're going to weave that into the context of the district energy concept. So, as Rob said, type your questions into the side there, and we'll address as many of those as we can as we move along here. So, again, I want to thank everybody for spending a few minutes with us here this afternoon. All right, one of the interesting things that has been happening in the market since about 2013 is the rapid adoption of renewable energy by, I'll call them in this context, corporates. And corporates includes the typical publicly traded Fortune 500 companies, among others, as well as institutions, universities, hospitals, typical mush market type activities, as well as municipalities. So this 206 number that you see on the left-hand side of the screen there really ought to have its own ticker. That is the commitment of corporates or companies to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And that number is growing almost daily. And it's really been remarkable to see the level of commitment from companies and institutions to achieve these goals and set aggressive science-based target goals and reduce their overall emissions. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see a brief snippet on the amount of money it's going to take to achieve those goals by 2030. It's roughly about $3.1 to $3.5 billion. So there's a lot of emphasis in this space. There's a lot of commitments. There's a lot of stakeholders who are very keen to see this happen for a variety of reasons. In the university space, I think you've seen a lot of stakeholder interest in divestment from their endowments of fossil fuel companies and using more renewable energies and putting more emphasis on sustainable practices and growth. And I know hospitals are starting to see some of that as well, although resiliency is playing a huge role there as well. And corporates have found a lever that they can pull. They can get quick scale on renewable energy, and we're going to talk about those different options in the context of this presentation. All right. I like Archimedes. I think business is all about leverage. And so essentially what's happened here since 2013, and this chart over to the right's a little abbreviated, but finance and contracting has changed, or the adoption has changed in order to allow large-scale purchases of renewable energy by corporates. And it's really been a remarkable success story over the past several years. You can see the 2018 column, there was about 75 deals done in 2018. 2019, year to date, we're at about 38. I expect we're going to eclipse 75 deals this year easily. This is the single busiest year in the wind industry, for instance. The production tax credit for wind is expiring at the end of this year, so a lot of contracting taking place on large utility scale deals as well as distributed generation, but really utility scale deals with corporates is driving the market right now. But we'll talk about some other ways you can also take advantage here. I also want to show you this next slide here, which is all about, this is my advertisement for efficiency. So the first thing is the most valuable unit of energy is the one you don't use and still get done what you need to do in your normal course of business. And you know, if you're a university, it's serving your student population. If you're a hospital, it's all about patient experience and patient health and patient outcomes, right? So how do you use less energy and still make that happen? So that's always number one of the discussion. But second is, the second most valuable is the unit of energy that you produce on site. And if you can use renewables on site, or a combination of renewables and low emissions fuels such as natural gas and others, it can really be a huge win for you. It may not scale as quickly as an off-site purchase agreement, but it still is something that needs to be looked at, and we'll talk a little bit about that down the road here. And the third most valuable unit of energy is the one you purchase smartly. So that's my slide on the importance of efficiency and then what you do after you achieve your efficiency. And I also want to bring this to a 50,000-foot level here. In the concept of district energy, you have two different scopes of greenhouse gases you're talking about, and it's going to put this on the table as we move along here. Scope one is the stuff you directly control and combust on site and own. So if you have your own nat gas boilers and furnaces and other things, that is a scope one emission, and you're purchasing gas and you're burning that on site. Many district energy systems and cooling systems, if they're owned by a third party and your campus or your hospital still consuming those, that's considered a scope two emission. And that's really where the off-site renewables are focused right now. But then we'll talk throughout the presentation on how you can take some of those same principles for buying renewable electricity and start applying those to the gas equation as well. So that's where we're going to go from here. All right, renewable energy purchasing options. There is spectrum, and they go all the way from generating your own on-site to purchasing renewable energy certificates. And there's different levels of commitment, internal rate of return or return on investment, and scalability of each one of those. And we'll talk about those in depth as we move down through the slide deck. But these are primarily the options you have before you at the moment. And we're going to dig into how those can be utilized by you or your customers. First is on-site generation, and simply what that means is you have your own generation on site. You have a solar array or a wind turbine or a combined heat and power system. Could be biomass fed or it could be natural gas fed. You have it behind your meter and you're producing some of your own energy on site, right? So this is typically a capital budgeting decision unless it's also a PPA, which is a power purchase agreement. So you can get it off balance sheet and have someone else own that asset and still be behind the meter, or you can own it yourself, right? So the typical way people approach renewables first is by looking at their behind-the-meter options, but you're constrained by space and available resource and those types of things in this instance. Second is the regional default mix, which is really easy to forget, but in almost every part of the country, there is renewable penetration. The number of renewables, while still small in relation to the overall energy generation mix in the country, it is increasing every year exponentially. And so I guarantee you, within your NERC region or your generation mix in the area or your utility, there is some renewables that are in there. And you can also apply those to your sustainability reporting requirements, right? So you could take advantage of that amount of default generation mix that's renewable in your area and claim that, right, as a scope 2 emission reduction. Next is green tariff utility rates, and these are really evolving right now in the marketplace. It started out, a lot of utilities will offer a green tariff rate, and it was all cost plus. So they would have a wind rate or a solar rate or maybe a biomass rate in some cases. But if you wanted renewable, you pay your normal rate plus you pay an adder to get the renewable benefit of that. Now, with the advent of the virtual power purchase agreement and the rapid scale of corporate deals offsite, where corporates can contract directly with developers, utilities have stepped in and they want a piece of that action as well. So now the green tariff rate has changed a little bit from being a cost plus initiative to now, a lot of times, if you have a big enough site or big enough load in a certain area the utility is offering a rate, you can typically get a discount to your current electric rate, which is, everybody would love to save a little money, right? So one of the hiccups there, though, is the utility is still able to charge you all of their riders and everything else, and they also have the power of the PUC to raise their rates and guarantee their rate of return. So while it may be attractive now, and you sign a 20-year deal with the utility for solar, for instance, 5 years from now, it may look different if the rates go up, and the Public Utility Commission allows the rates to go up at that point. But you still get the renewable benefit of that generation. Right now, the message here is these have changed from cost plus to a lot of times they're savings, but with some caveats. Next up is the traditional power purchase agreement. These can either be behind the meter, and there's about 20 states in the country that will allow you to do a PPA behind the meter regardless if the market's deregulated for power or not. And there is about 13 states in the country that have fully deregulated and open electric markets where you can choose your electric provider and you can go out and strike a PPA with a developer or an energy supplier in your area to supply you that power. The difference between a traditional power purchase agreement and a virtual power purchase agreement is that power can contractually flow to you via the transmission and distribution network that you're physically located. And a virtual power purchase agreement, which we'll get to in a little bit, is strictly a financial transaction. It can be cited theoretically anywhere, and you settle against the market wherever it's at. It doesn't really apply to your particular location. Next up is the virtual power purchase agreement, and this has really been the growth engine for offsite corporate renewable deals over the last 5 to 6 years. The key thing to notice on this slide is the blue line down the middle, sort of on the left-hand side of the slide. So what that slide delineates is the difference between physical flow and financial settlement. So everything to the left of that, or the right of that line, pardon me, shows how you would normally buy power today from your utility or third-party supplier if you're in a deregulated state. And everything to the left of that is how a virtual power purchase agreement would settle financially. And they're completely disconnected, right? So one side's your physical delivery, which doesn't change. The left side is the financial settlement of a virtual power purchase agreement. And so the way this works is the developer has a project they want to build, and they need to get it financed. So they go to a corporate, and they say, I'll sell you, I'll give you all the renewable attributes and sell you power, theoretically, financially, at a strike price for 15 years. And let's just say it's $20 strike price. And once you commit to it, they go and build the project because they can get their debt and equity financing, and then they sell that energy into the market. And that settles every hour. And then you get the difference between your strike price and the settlement. So if it settles at $30, pardon me, if the market settles at $30 and your strike price is $20, you're getting the renewable energy credit for every megawatt hour produced, and you're getting a $10 check for the difference between $30 settlement and a $20 strike price. If the market settles at $10, you're writing the developer a check for $10, but you're still getting the renewable energy credit. And the thing that's really interesting about these deals is if you've got a really diverse set of properties or locations around the country, and some in deregulated states, some in regulated states, and from an on-site perspective, you can never get to 100% clean energy, you could put one of these anywhere and use the effects of that for an entire operation within the United States. And so that's why these have become really interesting. They're also deep in the money right now. And what I mean by that is, the typical value on a virtual power purchase agreement is between $5 and $10 a megawatt hour. And so what that means is when you forecast over rate changes over 15 years and the market that they're in, typically you can count on a $5 to $10 check per megawatt hour coming back to you over that period of time for the amount of power you've contracted for. So that can mean $5 to $10 million on 100,000 megawatt hours annually over 15 years. It can be a significant amount of money. There's also risk associated with those. So, buyer beware. You want to make sure you do all the due diligence and checks and balances on that thing, but they're really attractive options right now for quick scale. Okay. The sort of the easy button approach and the traditional approach has been renewable energy credits. And as I mentioned before, all of the constructs that we talked about, with the exception of the regional default mix in your area, they would come with associated renewable energy credits. And a renewable energy credit equals 1 megawatt hour of renewable power generated and all the social and environmental benefits of that 1 megawatt hour of renewable power. It's a virtual transaction. In some cases it could be paper, but then you take that REC and a corporate retires that against their sustainability commitment, and they can then make claims and marketing claims that they're using renewable energy. So the REC market's been around for a long time. Right now, a national REC, voluntary REC in the country is about $1, maybe a little less. I'd say it's between 75 cents and $1 per megawatt hour. It's pretty inexpensive. The issue with RECs and why a lot of people are moving away from a strategy of just purchasing RECs is the concept of additionality. And what that means is it's a step beyond business as usual, right? So a REC being generated right now on a project that was built 10, 15 years ago as a merchant project, or an excess utility's got some excess RECs they don't need, that's not an additional project. That project wouldn't get built if it wasn't for your commitment to the project. So a lot of people think there's some additionality question marks on just purchasing a REC strategy, but it is inexpensive and it can allow you for quick scale, right? But then again, it's also additive, right? So I mentioned RECs in the voluntary market are about $1, so you're going to have your normal cost of power plus $1, right? So it's a cost plus option, but it's relatively easy entry and it's quick scale. All right, this is the solution spectrum. I like this slide quite a bit. So what this slide is showing you, if you look at the sort of the darker green dot right in the middle of the slide, that is going to be typically your highest return on investment and also your highest commitment and your best story as far as additionality and sustainability and those types of things, right? So that's typically going to be your on-site project. You reduced, you've done an efficiency project, you've reduced, you've put on some solar panels or maybe a wind turbine, maybe a hybrid system that combines both, and you're using that renewable energy for your process. That's going to have the highest value from an ROI perspective. It's also going to require the highest capital commitment from you, resource commitment in time, treasure, and talent. And it's also going to have the best story associated with it when you go out and market your sustainability efforts, right? But it's going to have scalability issues. Not every place out there has enough land mass or roof space or available resource to offset 100% of their load at every site. It's just physically not possible, right? So as you radiate out from that core, then the scalability of opportunities kind of opens up a little bit. Your story or your additionality story diminishes a hair, right? But your scale increases. So the next step would be a PPA in a deregulated market, for instance, or default market supply in some cases, but mostly it's PPAs and dereg markets. And then the next scope out is the virtual power purchase agreement, which we talked about can be a cash flow device as well as meets all the additionality requirements, has no upfront costs, but does carry some risks, right? And it's not directly located physically where your properties are at, so you got to weave a story around it a little bit, but it can be extremely effective in getting quick scale and still meeting additionality, right? And then on the outside of that circle is just a REC purchase strategy. I'm just going to go in the market, contact a broker, and buy renewable energy credits from them, or if I'm in deregulated markets, I'll buy it with my supply that comes in from my third-party supplier, right? So that's going to have the easiest barrier to entry, and it's going to have relatively low cost, high scale, but a lot less story and less of an additionality argument out on the edge of the circle there. Okay. Next is what I like to call the collaborative necessity. And what this means is these decisions, I've been in this business a long time, buying power and gas for folks, and most decisions are tactical, commodity-driven decisions within 1 year to 3 years time frame. These renewable energy decisions are highly, highly strategic, require a lot of resources, a lot of thought power, and they're long-term. So what that means is it involves a lot of different folks within the organization, and they're typically driven from the C-suite. I don't know how many times I've had conversations with supply chain folks and facilities folks, and like, we can't do a contract past 3 years, right? But in order to play here, you got to be able to contract for 20 years, 15 years, 12 years, right? So that takes a different level of scrutiny and in a lot of cases board approval and certainly C-suite approval, but it involves a lot of other aspects horizontally in the organization as well as vertically. So it involves your environmental health and safety, sustainability folks, your facilities folks, how they're going to be impacted, certainly your finance folks. When you start talking to the CFO about a virtual power purchase agreement, they're going to think, and you say, use the word derivative, they're going to freak out, but there's ways you can get around that, right? So it's not derivative accounting, but they have to be in the conversation all along. Your supply chain and procurement folks need to be included in that, and also your marketing communications folks, because they're going to be trumpeting the message to their stakeholders and markets on all the great things you're doing. And then the one thing I left off here, which is also critically important, is legal, right? So legal kind of underpins all those things, but nobody wants to have to deal with the lawyers, but they're a necessity, right? So legal is also important. And so really it's about communicating vertically and horizontally within the organization structure and having a champion that believes in it and is willing to do that and carry that ball and align everybody internally to get some of these deals done. That's a huge takeaway. All right, and once you've kind of gone through some of those options and figured out who you need to go to get things driven in the right direction, you need to create a roadmap. What is your goal? What's your target? Are they science-based targets? Are they RA100? Do you have other things you're trying to meet? How are you going to meet them? I typically see 3 different goals in a sustainability plan. You have one overarching greenhouse gas emissions goal. How are you going to meet that? You're going to meet it by energy efficiency. Typically, I always see an energy efficiency goal. The average building wastes about 30%, 20 to 30% of its energy consumption every day. I'm sure all of your operations are much more efficient than that. But energy efficiency is always number 1. And number 2 is renewable energy. Because energy efficiency, you can do all the Kaizens, all the waste walks you want. It's only going to get you so far. And if you're going to get your energy use intensity down to the level of your targets, which are usually pretty aggressive, you need to have some renewable energy in the mix. And it's easy, I say easy, there's less friction in getting your scope 2 emissions, which in the case of district energy could be either purchased electricity or purchased steam, heat, and cooling. You can use some of these mechanisms we just talked about here to address that. What is a little bit harder is to think about how do you solve for nat gas in the scope 1 world where you're directly combusting on site. And so what we're seeing in the marketplace right now is taking those same constructs that have worked in power over the last 10 plus years and starting to apply those to the natural gas world in terms of contracting for renewable natural gas from biogenic sources, biogas from landfills, ag waste, wastewater treatment plants, et cetera. Looking at creative ways to source offsets, to offset your scope 1 emissions, and other contracting mechanisms. But there's only a certain amount of resources you have to address that scope 1, and the market is really trying to shift now from how do we take the market mechanisms that work in power and apply those to nat gas. And so that's really sort of the interesting new spot that's starting to develop in this space, and we're monitoring that closely, working on a couple deals now that are real exciting. And for our own company, we have to figure out a way to meet some of these objectives. So, and then lastly is how do you measure all that? Usually that's pretty much spelled out with the reporting mechanisms and guidelines and protocols that are out there. Greenhouse gas accounting protocols is widely in use by most corporations. CDP questionnaire, they're all pretty similar on what's acceptable and how you can account for these things. And so again, scale on the power side, trying to get there on the gas side, but there are some tools out there to help you achieve this thing economically. And that's one of the biggest takeaways that most people have when they start exploring this is they've always thought sustainability was just a cost. It was just a cost of doing business and there was no real business case around it. And that's just not the case anymore. You can achieve a lot with a really solid pragmatic business case. In a lot of cases, make the corporation money. A quick story on that is we have a virtual power purchase agreement with Ingersoll Rand, which owns Train, and it started to produce power earlier this year, and it's been in the money every month. And now we're we do a great job spending money to invest in new products and so on and so forth. And now we have money coming in that's not from receivables. What do you do with that money, right? So that's an interesting challenge that a lot of companies are figuring out right now is how do you take that money? Does it just go to Treasury, or do you put it back in a pool that you continue to reinvest in other projects to create the virtuous cycle of sustainability? All right, helping to build a sustainable future. The triple bottom line, I'm sure most of you have probably heard of that, but it starts with financial. It has to start with financial. It's got to make good business sense at the end of the day, but you cannot neglect the social and environmental impact anymore of your operations. And we've just seen a huge uptick in commitments, in serious commitments, and really aggressive goals, and small teams of people in corporations that are smart people that are figuring out ways to green their businesses, make them much more sustainable, both from a supply chain and from a customer stakeholder perspective, as well as more financially sustainable as well. So it all goes hand in hand. All right, I put this slide in here just to show you a little bit about it. We're owned by Ingersoll Rand at Trane. Ingersoll Rand's a middle market industrial company. We have revenues in the $13 to $15 billion range. And, we have been one of the leaders in sustainability in our space from a manufacturing or industry perspective for a number of years. And there's a whole story behind that, but we take it very seriously, especially as a climate business like Trane in the HVAC space or Thermo King in the transportation space on the HVAC side. Refrigerant is a key component of products we sell. So we have made the commitment by 2030 to reduce customer carbon footprint by 1 gigaton. That is an enormous number, right? So, and we've also announced that we're going to achieve carbon neutral operations and net positive water by 2030. Those are not insignificant goals, and I'm not sure we 100% know how we're going to get there, but we crushed our 2020 goals 18 months early. It has really done great things for our business, both the bottom line and the top line, and for our employees and stakeholders, right? So it's really core to our mission in our day-to-day business. We're really excited about it, and we take it as a huge challenge. And the reason I share this slide with you is just to share a little bit of our journey and also tell you we're not just here consulting and telling you how to do it, we are actually doing it for ourselves, and we're using those principles as a middle market industrial to help others get up the scale quicker and learn from our mistakes along that path, right? And just to kind of sum things up here, before we open this thing up to some questions, district energy can be either scope 1 or scope 2 emissions, depending on if you own the assets or you do not own them and you just contract for the assets. So if you're an asset manager and you're selling on a consignment deal or a concession deal or some other structure to a hospital or a university or a municipality, for you, it's a scope 1 emission. For your customer, it's a scope 2 emission. And so there's more tools you have in your pocket to help them achieve their goals. And if you're on the customer side of that transaction, there's some tool, you can utilize the same toolbox to have intelligent discussions with your asset manager, right? If you own it and you're on the scope 1 side of things, then all is not lost. There's still some opportunity there, and it's emerging, and there's a lot of really cool segues to apply what has worked in power to what will work in natural gas. And I'm really excited to see how those are going to come together in the next few years. I think that's the next real growth area for the business and for the industry. And, electrification is one way, but not everything's going to get electrified, at least quick enough to meet some of these goals. So you've got to deal with natural gas. If you can come up with creative ways to solve for nat gas using those same tools, then I think it's going to be really interesting. Many different tools to meet commitments. We kind of talked about that. Of those, I have 3 takeaways for you here. Additionality is key. Companies want to be able to point to an impact or an innovation in a community with a technology, whatever it may be, that it's new, different, and innovative, because it's really key to them not only meeting their goals, but showing their stakeholders and their customers that they're new, innovative, and creative, right? So additionality is key, so going beyond the business as usual case. Innovation is important. We talked about that. We just did a virtual power purchase agreement evaluation for a large industrial corporation, and almost as important to them as the quantitative side of the analysis was the qualitative side of the analysis. What community is this going in? What is the economic impact in that community? How has that community been affected previously by job loss? A lot of different things we measured and were able to really dig in the weeds on. They use those criteria just as much as they use the quantitative hard math on the return. And it was a really interesting combination of the qualitative and the quantitative on So innovation is important to these folks, and the impact they're making with their commitments is very critical as well. Firming to 100% renewables is next. So that what that means is, you can go out and do a wind deal in West Texas or some other part of the country, but that's profile of wind or solar is not 24/7. So the next iteration is, well, how do we get 100% renewables 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to match our load, right? So that's a different proposition. It could involve combining a portfolio of wind and storage, or wind, solar, and storage, or some other generation, maybe even hydro. That's also the next iteration of where this thing is going, is how do we make it much more relatable to our business, both from a risk perspective and an image perspective. We talked a lot about solving for nat gas in this discussion, and how you can use some of those tools, or how they're starting to be used for nat gas, the power tools for nat gas. And then utilizing experience with electric deals at scale is the basis of that next iteration for gas, right? So the last takeaway I'll leave with you here is, there's a lot of tools at your disposal. If you just want to get your feet wet, then there's an easy button approach that can get you in and get you scaled quickly. And then after you do that, if you want to start talking about more impact, more cash flow, more other things, there's a lot of other things to explore here, right? So whether you're an asset manager and looking to generate a renewable cooling program for your customers, or you are a customer and you want to offset your emissions from scope 1 and scope 2, there's tools out there for you to do that, right? So I hope you got a little bit out of this today, and I'd like to just throw this open to Rob and see if there's any questions out there.
Thanks very much, Bo. Very interesting, and we do have some questions. Cheryl, if you'd maybe give me back the ball, but before we get to the questions, Bo, I just want, would you say that like renewables and procurement, are they being largely driven by state policy, and are you seeing, sort of states with, high percentage targets being sort of the, the blue water for, more portfolio development? Are there some, states where activity is higher than others?
So it's not right. It's not impacting corporate decisions. What it is impacting is state policy is impacting the price that a developer is willing to offer on a project in a given area.
I see.
And so if there's a high incentive in certain states, or there's a compliance rec price that is really attractive in some areas, you can get a lower cost on a deal than you could in areas where there's not a lot of progressive states.
Yeah, so your context is really corporations. You started the presentation with 80% of the top 250 corporations are really kind of engaged in this activity.
Yes.
So that's really more of your context, I think, right?
Exactly, and where the change has been was the developers used to just build projects for utilities to meet their renewable portfolio goals.
Right.
And then they realized most of those goals were being met. Now they had to sell to somebody else, so the corporates have stepped in now. They've taken
Right, and they're perceiving value both in the bottom line, as you said, and also in their identity and a corporate mission and sustainability directives and kind of annual report, right? I mean, investors are looking for these corporations to demonstrate sustainable activities, and you're saying that really is driving the market.
At the moment, yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Very good. So we do have some questions. First one, Bo, so this really goes to, I think, some of the mechanics. So if other entities are buying the RECs, does that mean that the users cannot claim the renewables either on-site or as part of the regional default generation mix? How do you sort of avoid double dipping and not having the renewables counted twice?
Sure. So the way that would work in your area is just like we talked about the state mandates. the utility has to own a certain number of renewables and the associated renewable energy credit, and that has to be retired. So if Pennsylvania has to have 30% renewables, then that 30% of their overall load, all the RECs associated with that are retired by the utility to meet that load, so they cannot be sold to another party, right? So
I see.
That's a way you can claim the default mix and still be creditable, right? If a utility in Pennsylvania has excess RECs, meaning they're long, they've generated more than they need for compliance, they'll put those out on the market, in the voluntary market.
Yes.
They'll try to sell them to a compliance buyer first, but then they'll sell them to the voluntary market, and you can buy those and retire those, right?
Yes. Okay, so they're not really double counted. It's really a question of, are they part of a state target sort of inventory, or are they? So there really isn't sort of a double dipping in that case. They're not being counted twice.
Correct.
Here's a related question, I think. So in trying to claim excess renewables from default. So the question is, isn't the default, so the excess renewables, going to reflect in the regional ISO's electric carbon footprint? So I think the question is, in I guess in an ISO or an eGrid, calculation, how is the sort of excess, how are the excess RECs accounted for? Maybe that's not the question, but when you're going to the default market,
Sure.
How are they reflected in the ISOs? I guess it's really their eGrid rating, right? How clean is the grid?
Exactly. Yeah. So there theoretically an excess REC would be somewhat associated there because the generation mix does impact that. So you got to be a little bit careful on what exactly you're claiming from the default mix. But both the Greenhouse Gas Accounting Protocol and the CDP will allow you to use that accounting method.
Yes. Okay. And all right. So next question. Thank you, Bo. So the next question is: so as renewables increase their market penetration, what is the forecasted energy values for hours with high renewable contributions? So like afternoon. Will midday power get cheaper due to more solar being, input to the grid, and will the nighttime rate sort of, increase? Do you see an inversion potentially happening with? My initial reaction to that question is the percentage of renewables to traditional portfolio isn't there yet, right? But what do you think? Do you see this? Sort of pricing inverting at any time soon?
You can, and you've seen it in some areas of the country. California right now is the easy one that everyone talks about, the duck curve.
Duck curve, yes.
And so California alone accounts for 40% of the solar market in the United States. There's a lot of solar there. So during the afternoon hours, they're producing an awful lot of power that doesn't have a lot of value, and they're overproducing. And then when everybody gets home and the sun starts to kind of dip and usage goes up, then solar is not producing as much. And so you get this big dip during the midday, and then it starts ramping back up at night. And so what you have is utilities go into what's called time of use rates. And so you used to pay 12 cents. Now you're in a time of use rate at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., you're paying 40 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yes.
And what they're telling you is they're giving you a clear signal that you need to figure out a way to bring that down at that time. And you're also seeing it in Texas, in wind. In West Texas, there's a lot of wind built. It's overbuilt, oversaturated with wind, and there's not a lot of load there. And so you will see, especially at night in some cases, highly negative prices. Right.
Yeah, so the challenge currently is that loads don't necessarily match production. There isn't the symmetry that we'd all like. Maybe that's where storage comes in. or maybe even like happens in parts of Europe where, electric boilers are using that negative price electricity, converting it to heat for, the next day's use. This is sort of the Chinese proverb, right? We're living in interesting times. And I think, when I look at your job description, I'm guessing that your life has really gotten a lot more interesting over the past few years, right? With all of this sort of transactional and market penetration. It's really pretty fascinating.
It is, yes, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Next question relates to Scope 1 gas. So, the question is, so similar to companies that like match investors with wind or solar developers, are there companies that are currently looking at matching customers with project developers doing decarbonization, like renewable natural gas? Do you see market? You talked about the sort of the adoption of these electricity protocols for gas, right? So natural gas sort of adopting these approaches. Do you see really market participation to get to scale for renewable natural gas? Is that happening early stage? What do you see out there?
Yeah, it is happening. It's very at the moment, but it is happening. There's a fairly robust market for renewable natural gas. Unfortunately, it is a transportation market. But there's interesting ways that you can leverage that, right? So you're using RNG for CNG replacement, LNG replacement in vehicles, and there's a group called REBA in Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. That's the granddaddy of the VPPA group, right? So, and that's where buyers and sellers meet, and they're figuring out how to scale the business and do it productively. There's a new group that's formed out of that called the Renewable Thermal Collaborative. And there's some big names that have signed up to that. And they're very much on the front end of the curve where REBA was 10 years ago. And I expect that to only steepen and get more interest around it. Yeah. So there's definitely, it's very early. There's a lot of early adopters playing in the market, but it'll scale eventually.
Now, are you seeing? Because we're seeing some headwinds to natural gas. In states like New York, of course, there's a moratorium. California, I think, has really sort of stiff-armed. I don't mean to be pejorative here, but there has been, I think, some sensitivity to natural gas and sort of proliferation. In that, do you see where like renewable natural gas can be developed at scale, and biogases and other waste streams injected into gas pipelines, and like you've talked about, sort of almost a virtual sort of PPA? Hey, I've got a contract for this many decatherms. I'm not going to buy it physically, but if you put it in the pipeline, I'll get credit for it. Do you see that sort of transaction happening anytime soon?
Yes, we've seen one or two deals done like that currently.
Yep.
And there's more interest around that right now. Keep in mind, renewable natural gas can only offset somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20% of natural gas consumption.
Yes.
At real scale, right? So
yes.
Most people are defaulting to electrification.
Yes.
And so the reason they're doing it in both transportation and in the stationary setting, the reason they're doing that is because we figured out how to scale solutions for the electricity market, right?
Yes, right.
It's more mature. As the thermal market comes along, I think you'll see that, and I think the real scalable solution there for heavy industry may be hydrogen, but that's the ways off.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's going to be a very interesting place to monitor and be involved. A lot of the IDA members, of course, are large thermal producers and users, right? So that's where we butter our bread. so cleaner fuels, I think, will be of increasing value to us. Another question, Bo, what are some of the positives of using, virtual PPAs for developers? How does it really help a developer, to use that tool, VPPA?
So what a VPPA does for a developer, it gives them price certainty. And price certainty is a golden thing when you're trying to finance a project and build a project.
Yes.
So that's why you'll see long-term deals in 12 to 15-year range for a fixed price for a lot of power. And, you can get really great deals. And bear in mind, most developers are developing, and then the financial owner, the asset manager, takes over. So the developer makes their money on the front end through the development of the project into commercial operation. And then they move on to the next project. In some cases, they buy and hold, right, and the very largest that are out there. But so they really don't care. They're not really incentivized to maximize the dollar of the energy. They just want to get a dollar that works for them so they can finance and build the project. Right.
Thank you. So next, another question we had, where do you see the future of geothermal being used to offset natural gas infrastructure? Are customers, looking at the sort of thermal cooling solutions and, looking to the earth for an alternative to a fossil arrangement, or are they largely still focused on power, so, wind, solar, storage? I guess that probably is a function of region, right? Maybe location, climate. But what's your sense? Do you see geothermal making progress here in North America?
We are. We're seeing an uptick and definitely an interest on geothermal plants, and geothermal at district energy scale is really interesting right now for K through 12 schools. We've seen a number move that direction. We've seen some universities take a good hard look at it. I've yet to see it in a hospital setting, but there's a lot of interest in it, and there's a lot of limitations that come along with that, but it's a technology that's generating a lot of buzz.
Yes, and I think people, are looking at, we can't overlook, thermal heating and cooling is, at least in Europe, it's more than 50% of primary energy, consumption. So, we can't overlook it. It isn't all about electrons all the time. Another question we had, Bo, so, and I think this actually goes back to an earlier comment. So with renewable natural gas, really getting sort of big money for RINs and LCFS, credits. So really it seems like the market is strongest for transport, right? That's kind of where they're gaining sort of higher value there. Do you see, do you foresee a shift for renewable natural gas anytime soon for the industrials who, really do want, a greener fuel source?
Yeah, I think
where's that price point, I guess? Where do you think it is?
Yeah, so there's two different ways I see it coming. One is I think the utilities are going to open up a market because they want the gas. The gas utilities are going to want to get some feed-in tariffs to get that gas. And the second is corporates are very ambitiously want that gas. There was a deal done by L'Oreal, the makeup manufacturer, recently, about a year ago, where they're buying gas from a landfill, renewable natural gas from a landfill, and then they're turning around and selling it to the transportation markets while the value is high. Mm-hmm. So they've entered a long-term deal, and they're back-to-back selling the gas to the transportation markets. They're taking the money from that sale. They're purchasing an offset so they can offset their nat gas emissions nationally, and then they're banking the rest of the money to buy down the term of the deal. Let's say it's a 15-year deal. They're buying down the tail end of the deal because the policy periods that are creating the demand and the high price on the transportation markets are policy periods, and they're subject to the whims of the EPA and California Air Resource Board. So
yeah, and they're probably more likely to sunset sooner rather than later, right? So
exactly, yeah. So there's risk there, and if you can go to a developer and say, I can give you some price certainty, I can give you a guarantee of say $15 an MMBTU, and you can make a lot more money than that with selling it to the transportation market short term.
Right.
What I mean short term can be 5 to 10 year window.
Right.
But then I can take some of that cash and use to help me make a business case to meet some of my other goals. And then if that program goes away, I'll just take the gas and the associated.
Right. Right.
So we're seeing, I think that is sort of a VPPA-like structure for gas. Currently working on a few of those deals.
Right. Do you see, there's a couple more questions I'll certainly get to, but, I'm curious. There is talk of PURPO Reform, right? And changing the threshold, reducing it to under 2 megawatts, cutting the terms allowed. From where you sit, do you see PURPO, reform is probably not the right word, but, a change in PURPO impacting these markets, particularly, the VPPA and some of these renewable projects?
I do. I think the way it's currently proposed at FERC is going to strangle the market in states that really don't like PURPO, which there's a number of.
Yeah.
And some of the thresholds they're putting on a qualifying project are really draconian.
Right.
I think it's also just going to drive more developers to go to the corporate market and figure out different structures to get their projects built.
Do you think it'll bifurcate the market too? Like, it'll just be okay. We're not going to work in that state. They're PURPO. They're anti. So, but I guess I don't know. There's going to always be this kind of issue of states' rights and federal oversight, right?
Exactly.
So we don't have time. I'm sorry to digress. So let me get to the next question. That's a philosophical question, better done over a beer or two.
Agreed.
So Bo, any comments on the future viability of VPPAs? So if there are declining prices at some of the trading hubs on the grid, and there is, as you said, like in West Texas, California, some large renewable projects, a lot of density. Is there concern that some of these may have increased price volatility, during the contract period? I mean, would it be your advice to sort of, get in, strike, and maximize, your performance? Is there risk that really for these virtual PPAs, and where would it go? Where would the risk be?
Yes, the answer is yes. Short answer. The longer answer is there's a couple different types of risk in these deals. There's market risk, which is really what we're talking about here, and then there's also execution risk. So, is the project going to get built, right? So, by the time you sign the VPPA and the time it goes to commercial operation can be as much as 2 years. So,
yes,
you want to make sure it's going to get built, right? So, and then you want to make sure it's going to be profitable. And I do think there's areas of the country, West Texas wind, for instance, solar in California, and there's a large build out of solar in North Carolina, but there's enough load there that I think you're going to be okay. So the long answer is yes, you need to have someone who understands the way the market moves and the impact of those projects in certain areas in supply demand balance. And so I would suggest getting some good guidance there and some good forecasts. But a forecast is just a forecast.
Yes.
And on a 12 to 15-year deal, there's definitely risk there. Do I think prices are going to go to near zero and stay there? No.
Right.
And prices are so undervalued right now that in most cases they're in the money almost immediately.
Right.
They're definitely worth a look. So my long answer would be prudent about what markets you're looking in and consider a portfolio.
Yes.
Technology, wind and solar complement each other well, and also location. Right.
Yes. not all your eggs in a single basket. So it looks like this may be the last question. Is there a difference between utility-provided renewable energy versus local renewable investments, and what should be accounted for in a decision to balance these? So I guess the question is, if you're doing a procurement, right? So you want to buy RECs, maybe. I'm not sure if I have the context correct for the question. So are utility-provided renewable energy versus local investment? I guess the question is, how do you balance the risk-reward of those? You did say it. You said, if you want to do it yourself behind the meter, then that's your capital or someone else's capital, and there's that. Versus maybe, and I think you called buying RECs sort of the easy button, right? Solution.
Yes.
But the reward is different, though, right? The scale of the reward.
That's right. Yeah. And I'll take it a slightly different direction. So if a utility comes to you and says, "Look, I've got a solar provider that's given me power really cheaply, and I want to pass this on to you, and for 20 years or whatever the deal is." So typically in that context, you're only going to be able to buy as much power as your facility that utility serves uses. So maybe it's 110% of that amount of power. So you're not going to be able to scale that purchase across 20 facilities in 15 states.
Right.
So where you can get an impact on local investment, and you're not going to have any control over where that goes, but it is going to go within the region that utility's in, so it's closely matched to where your facility is, where the utility is, and where the investment's going locally.
Right.
If you do a VPPA straight with a developer, you can cover more load, be a little bit more creative, and find a location that's really high impact that maybe has lost a lot of jobs because coal mine shut down or some other situation, right? So then you can be more creative about where it goes and the impact story can be. You have more control over the local impact that project makes that you're contributing to. Does that make sense?
I see. Yes. So in evaluating, sort of those scenarios, that's where you mentioned earlier, right? All the parties, sort of involved in this decision, you might value sort of the market annual report value over, the savings or operational benefits, right? But that's I guess you have to make that currency determination as an organization. Interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. These are very interesting times, Bo. Thank you very much. It was and I want to thank some of our participants who thanked you for the comments, the participation. If anyone would like to reach out to Bo directly, his email is here, bo.griffey@train.com. Bo, I hope that's okay. I didn't mean to, volunteer you for, but that's part of the reason why we're all here is to help each other. So, Bo, on behalf of IDA and our members worldwide, thanks so much for sharing of your expertise and giving us the insights that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well done. Well done. And again, so the webinar will be available at the conclusion. All of the participants, you'll get a link. So it won't be immediate. The slides will not be immediately available, but WebEx will get them configured, and then the streaming video, that'll be made available shortly so that you can share it, with colleagues who weren't here. Let me also take this opportunity to invite all of you on the call still to join us in Denver in February at Campus Energy 2020. We're expecting basically a sold-out event, so please go to our website, register soon. Certainly book your hotel, and the early bird rate expires next Friday. Just a heads up for those of you who are thinking about joining us. It's going to be also, I think, a very really strong conference technical program, and we'll look forward to seeing you in Denver. And then finally, please keep your calendars clear for end of June, June 22 through 25. IDEA will be in Washington, D.C. for IDEA 2020, I think it's our 111th annual conference at the Omni Showroom. The call for papers is still open, so please visit our website if you'd like to participate as a speaker. We're happy to hear things you're working on, projects you're doing, and topics of interest. So I want to conclude by thanking Bo Griffey and our sponsors, sustaining sponsors at Train, really an excellent organization. And Bo, on behalf of IDEA, thank you again for making the time and for, delivering this very valuable and important content.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thanks all. We're going to sign off for now. And if anyone needs, further assistance, don't hesitate to reach out to IDEA at districtenergy.org. We're here to help. And again, thank you all for participating and spending part of your afternoon with us. Bye for now.